Hello everyone, today we talk about discipline in the 6th century Roman army with a bit of comparison previous times, what's the broader issue here, and eventually look at some concrete examples that do not go just with the soldier discipline, but also with properly the political control of armies during the 6th century. So in this picture, military laws and regulations were probably spread and constantly remembered to the troops reunited for the occasion. We know this, that the main source is the Strategicon, which says this specifically in Book 1.8.16, and discipline was therefore read properly, both in Latin and in Greek, which at the time, Latin was still the official language of the empire and the army, right? Were especially the most, in fact, Latinized elements survived also in Greek eventually. While Greek, especially in this phase where the empire now has been shifted towards its eastern half, as its center naturally was spoken by most subjects and soldiers, but not only because naturally you have to understand the 6th century, it's a very multi-ethnic army, right? We will have to talk about it more in Outlook, but let's say there is surely a survival of previous military organization, but it had gone pretty mixed up, and new contingents were formed. A lot of auxiliaries, right? A lot of federati or summachoi were at this point integrated in the armies that were sometimes recruited ad hoc, even with private means. Think about the bucellari and so on. So it's a very fluid system, and this, as you understand, is not particularly good for discipline, and that's what we will be defined. Not because discipline was necessarily low, but concretely the political ties here were looser. Mm-hmm. And the state properly now is at some levels struggling to control, especially in the frontier, for the armies that often rebel, right, and appoint a new emperor. So this list was the discipline was issued like that, where it was a list of disciplinary provisions contemplated for those who would have violated them, and that penalty was contemplated for the following crimes. So first of all, desertion. That not only the responsible of desertion, but also who having come to know of the deserter's intention, had not exposed him, not denounced him. The abandonment or super-advancement of the assigned place in combat, right, or the escape in front of the enemy. The non-authorized sacking of the camp and enemy wagons. This was very important for. Now we'll comment them a little bit, but it was extremely important for the broader order of the army. The same goes for the depredation of the fallen, in virtue of, as we just said, of the most grave collective danger that such practice entailed. Conspiracy and mutiny, in particular for those who had headed them. So you already see here some pattern. Fundamentally, these are common crimes in war in all times, but there is definitely an effort to keep things under control at every moment, right? And even contrasting mutiny, which began to be endemic at some level in this century. So this is what the authorities were extremely careful about. There was still this time decimation, in Greek known as apodekatos, in case of cowardice and abandonment of the spot from the side of an entire unit. We get this from the Strategicon 1.8.17. While those who had remained wounded in this occasion, that would have been exempted. That is, if you abandon your post while you're wounded, you will not be let's say, put in the list. But still, as you understand, this is not easy, and all throughout military history, you know that there were people who preferred even to wound themselves rather than to go into combat, and that surely was punished in some way. So, in general outline, it seems we can grasp a sort of softening of penalties compared to past centuries, or previous centuries. For example, there is no death penalty for those who would have had abandoned arms. And furthermore, in case of the loss of the standard or of its own capture from the side of the enemy, the penalty for the bearers consisted in degradation to the lowest rank of their unit, which previous times actually would have brought to death. Actually, an ensign bearer was expected to die in the first place if he had lost the ensign, because if he had lost it, it meant that he would have done anything, even getting to the midst of the enemies to get it back. Like, this is especially what in the early times, think about the Republic, that was the ideal. And don't think it was so distant from reality at some point. Here we're not intending that discipline. I mean, discipline may have actually been more lax, right? Certain provisions, as we'll say now, were actually harsh. So we cannot properly identify through them a less, a lower combativity or capacity, etc., or courage, because those are things that historically are always more or less at the same level. The point here is that the authorities accept this softer punishments evidently because of fear of mutiny, right? So it's not a problem of military quality in a sense, or military standards, let's say, better, but rather of political control of the army itself. Because as we will see, soldiers did complain, and in this heterogeneous army it was difficult to impose an homogeneous discipline. In the aforementioned crimes, other motivations could be admitted to, not to inflict them, yet they had to, of course, be acceptable and evident. Insubordination towards their intermediate superiors, so decharchs, pentarchs, tetrarchs, was punished in a non-precise way, probably with fines or monetary sanctions in general, while only the one towards the tagma commander, that is either the comes or the tribune, was for sure punished with death. Also consider that in previous times, Roman discipline had never been properly standard as we intended today, right? Even in the glorious, let's say, in the mythological times, we could even term them like that. The extremely harsh Roman discipline, things like decimation, etc., were something that happened, rarely, first of all, but especially discretionally speaking, right? They were, just to give an example in a specific situation, you never kid with an army that, of course, can always mutiny, that you have to preserve moral. There is no standard, let's say, imposition of law like in contemporary times, so of martial law. So naturally, that's where we cannot fully understand whether this, by the 6th century, this manuals, these laws had gotten kind of more realistic, more objective about what concretely happened, because there was properly no concrete standardization. There had been like a standard fixed issue how to cope, and every single time would regarding to martial issues. So even in here, actually, we may spot, telling the truth, maybe an extension of a more homogeneous practice, at least prescriptionally, at least in this broader, in these circles, like the Strategicon is thought to have been written at court. So in reality, is that we're surely in part detached from the army, but also display, kind of understanding that we should be definitely wary of. also the commanders were, and this is important in fact, were meant to observe specific laws and regulations. Right, this goes a bit into the broader autocratic nature also of the Justinian Empire, and how the Roman Empire was transforming at this point. For example, commanders could not grant licenses in wartime, penalty the payment of heavy fines. This is the Strategicon 1714. In some cases, commanders also risked death penalty, such as in the case of the abandonment of a city or a fortress. That at this point, with the contraction of urbanism, but the paradoxically the increasing importance of these infrastructures in a world that was contracting demographically, economically. So infrastructures were a real asset, right? So this became ever more important. So if a city or a fortress was still could still be defended, the commander had to protect it, unless, this is what law says, the commander hadn't found himself in danger of life. Then we don't know exactly what this means. Like, if the guy is threatened to be killed by martial law because of having abandoned that city or fortress, why would he have the allowance of abandoning it, if he thinks that he's in danger of his own life, right? It's kind of but this tells you also about the broader incoherence that sometimes the source is expressed, because, as we were saying before, there is no fixed standard, right? This is not a completely systematic and it's information. And even when the same author wrote these things, sometimes you have even trouble saying what it actually meant, like properly from a logical point of view, not just because we don't know how this was concretely applicated, because properly these texts do not reflect reality, cent for cent. Commanders were also obliged to inform correctly and integrally their subordinates, therefore not to make them run into the crime of insubordination themselves, and to verify the correctness of their behavior. The Decarchs in particular had to exact that, as many benefited of the apposite indemnities known as reparazione, would acquire and make them regularly, the arms and equipment regularly maintained, responding of it in front of their commander. Penalties and sanctions were contemplated also in the case of damage of any kind provoked to civilians, and or how were defined with a rather modern term, the contribuents. Let's say in Greek it's syntelestes, right? So those who at this time literally paid for the army, because basically the greatest expense of the empire was that. So this naturally reflects the common problems of a pre-industrial society with a looser statal control of the military instrument like our own. Here, especially in the countryside, it was an increasing privatization of power. So armies were collected, gathered. Sometimes even think about the kind of certain allies and their kind of lives, especially from the steppes. It was based on reigning, etc. That wouldn't quite distinguish the difference between a civilian and military environment. I mean, they just loot. They don't care where they are. And of course, consider also that the empire was pretty large. So, armies recruited somewhere, even within the frontier, were made up of people that of course didn't give a damn about somebody who, lived from the opposite end of the empire. So these things did happen. And of course, the population was always, in a sense, squeezed wherever these arms passed. Logistics surely worked. It was an important way of making everything regular, but the practice in its reality was much more crude, as always. And however, in case of lack of compensation for the damage, was contemplated a sanction that would be double its value, which is a lot, and in a way reflects also the incapacity of authority to actually exact these sanctions when they're very high. Usually it's because the law is not able to make it work, so they would try to cash it, but it wouldn't happen all times, at least. And the rules listed in the Strategicon seem to have had a long life. Also because, of course, they were somewhat, logical. I mean, in a context, they were reproposed in an almost integral form up to the 10th century, with some exceptions. This was the time of the big empire, where everything had worked fine, right? Eventually there was a big contraction in the following century, so this time remained as a sort of model, right, of universal, of ecumenic unity and of order and model, etc. By the 10th century, we're talking, of course, Leo's Tactica, and here we can find some parallelisms because, for example, the lack of, or the retarded, belated coming back of a license entailed the expulsion from the army and the referring to civilian authority for a trial, according to Strategicon 1.6, while in the Tactica 8.4, perhaps because of loss, demographic crisis, the loss of organic, was contemplated a punishment consisting in a continuous, guard watch. This is interesting because indeed it tells the story of a need of personnel on the spot, and also with a specific military function. Surely by the time of the Strategicon, things were easier overall than in the 10th century. For what concerns the discipline of loot, so the right of prey was recognized by military laws, but with some limitations. The sack of the enemy camp or carriages was forbidden if without a specific authorization, as we were saying before, with against very serious provisions, including death penalty. This is a pretty standard in all times, because the point here was that, as you know, it is if you know ancient medieval warfare or even later one, what these armies did normally was winning the battle, and there were several lines deployed in depth, and then when, let's say, the first one had won and didn't see no other lines in the front, which would happen because battlefields extended for kilometers, so literally these lines were very distant. They would say, okay, we're done, we won, let's abandon formation, let's spread, and let's loot. And that was the best moment in which maybe a concealed enemy line or even reserve could intervene and take out everybody, simply because, of course, they were not in formation, so they, if you're not, you're done for. Doesn't matter who you are. So this was one of the riskiest moments, let's say, where some of the worst defeats historically occurred for this reason. So everybody knew at the time, and this is a pretty standard penalty, for which, of course, death was issued. For this reason too, the Strategicon 9.13 recommended to destine to the sack, to the loot, just a minority part of the force, while, so this could be also the non-armed, organic that always followed the armies, right? Even the lighter troops, usually, even auxiliaries, that had maybe even fought the battle, but they were spent once they had, I don't know, think about horse archers, but they had exhausted their arrows. Well, at that point they can't even make a rank because they're light cavalry, they can't hold the ground, so they usually ran past the enemy and loot the camp, maybe even when the battle was still going on. This mostly didn't quite happen. It was actually, that would have been an act of indiscipline if the rank was still, intact, and they would break it to go do that. But it happened all the time, so we'll see it better later, what degree of, endemic indiscipline existed, and how this was a freaking mess for any commander on the field, a nightmare, literally. And a frustration, that's also how war goes, meaning that it's not a video game where you control everything and units just do whatever you do. Real war doesn't work like that. And of course, in all this, the strategicon says that the bulk of the force had to remain into a regular formation to ensure an adequate cover, because they needed to loot, sometimes even quickly, right? Of course, this is still a moment in which pitched battles, important clashes, large armies were still out there, but it was still beginning to shrink into, as always, at all times, most of war is fought in skirmishes and smaller engagements and so on. In fact, there is a passage from the Strategicon, I think we read on the video we made on the Slavs, Strategicon 11.4, that suggests a complex tactical procedure for the sack of the territory of the Antes, that was this population of Slavic ethnicity that settled north of the Danube. That passage is extremely interesting. If you go Migration Era playlist, you'll find, I don't remember what it's, it's the Slavs and Antes from Slavic warfare from early medieval times, from that's model on the Strategicon and also on the Tactica that copied a little, and you understand there, because Slavic warfare was, the Romans coped with it in these ambushes, hit and run tactics, so that they rarely came to grips in open field, and everything was based on this rapidity of movement, right? So that would have been pretty standard in the Balkans as a kind of guerrilla warfare. And in this passage says that the raid had to happen rapidly, systematically, in order to avoid that the operations of booty collection would cause the uncontrolled escape of the enemy or his recompaction. So you had to find them, before they would run away, and especially you had to watch out because they would reform in the forests, wherever, even in the swamps, and reattack you when you were looting. And as we've seen, that's what you really don't want to happen. And this is mostly referred also to smaller amount of forces, right? This takes tactical as well as strategical meaning on, in the Strategicon, so that even larger operations were actually carried out like that. But you can understand how times and space at that point it varies. How these penalties were actually carried out in the field also we have very few information about. Maurice doesn't precise any type of punishment inflicted, albeit a law remembers the use of flogging, but as we will see, there were also much more brutal ways to especially kill as a punishment. In time of war, discipline was surely harsh, right? We don't have to think that when the means existed to impose a discipline, the generals would actually use them. Generals were specifically military magistrates, right? They had the faculty of emitting that penalty of and they did it quite easily, right? They had the power, they were endowed with the power of doing it. In 533, Belisarius, in force of his absolute powers of generalissimo, pronounced certain penalties, certain sentences for military crimes, and had two Bulgar allies impaled because they had killed a colleague of theirs in a state of drunkenness. And he extended, thus, as Procopius, that tells the story, observes, the same punishments contemplated for the Romans. This is important because the allies, as we explained many times, were not part of the army, right? The federati or symmachoi, this point, were literally foreigners that had joined, right? As they were contractors fundamentally. So the question here is important because the army is Roman. There are Roman soldiers, and that there are Roman subjects. They're under Roman law, etc. But this is not meant to be also for foreigners in the Roman army. But of course, martial law, for the sake of discipline, at this point, is imposed by such an energetic general like Belisarius on everybody, all the components of the army. At this point, the thing, however, didn't go without consequences, because the colleagues of those who had, of the Bulgars, protested energetically. And to these lamentations, also some Roman regular soldiers joined, because, quote, Procopius says, they were worried that they might have been punished for some, for some fault. And this is eloquent, because it says how even the Roman soldiery at this point didn't expect such, harshness, such as death penalty by impaling, and it would be strange if you think about it in an army that is regular, professional army, so that would say, okay, we're perfectly drilled, disciplined, nobody does anything if otherwise they get killed, right? So this already speaks for the broader arrangement of these armies, their composition, but their motivation, right? Some years later, the same penalty was inflicted to Doryphorus, who had betrayed the Romans, who was impaled next to the walls of Carthage. In winter 537-538, during the Ostrogothic siege of Rome, Belisarius had the nose and ears of a citizen cut, because the guy had wanted to, to let the enemies in the urbs. This guy was probably a member of the city militia, right? And plus, the disfigured guy was sent by Belisarius to King Vitiges of the Goths over a donkey's back. This, it's a kind of psychological warfare, right? It happens also many times. I don't know, I think in Middle Ages, how many spies or traitors were trebucheted into the enemy camps or things like that, because it's horrifying as well. As think about Basil II, that blinded all the Bulgars he found except 1 over 100, because they would lead the column to back home. So it was a way of seeing how brutal the thing could happen. And in fact, this is something we somewhat underestimate. I mean, how in these times, that were surely very far from ours, even morally speaking, but still news of such ferocities and such cruelties did strike the impression, let's say the opinion of these authors, commentators, because evidently they were still seen as something extremely brutal and worth of pointing out. It didn't happen regularly. So especially in disciplinary matters, like of course these soldiers would commit the most unspeakable kind of atrocities, because that's exactly what war displays every time. It would be, but the fact that this could be inflicted to soldiers by a general is the deal, rather, right? And it wasn't the general wasn't expected to be so impositive, so harsh as well. And a treacherous soldier that had sent messages to the gods of Osimus was burnt alive in 539 on the indication of his comrades, to whom Belisarius had asked how to punish him. So this naturally reveals those same, that same bloodthirst existing ethically also among soldiers in Germany. This was no nice place to say. Let's say that at this point, of course, units would maintain largely their discipline also alone, by themselves, right? There was some typical camaraderie in the most abusive, traumatic, aggressive form is something that, exists. It still exists actually in the world in many militaries. And it is, in a way, a a poor mean, I would say, to maintain discipline in the case of the absence of a higher authority. That this mostly happens in kind of faulty states where the military is kind of a caste and not much of a soldiery citizenry. So we know that in practice, but this form of camaraderie, bullying, but whatever you want to call it, it's definitely also, and it's connected to the actual necessities of. Here we're talking about a war, a real war being fought. So the same comrades decided that it was better to burn this guy alive than having it among their within their unit. So in 544, before the battle of the Volturno River against the Franks and the Alemanni, Narses had executed on the field by his Doriforoi an Herulian ally, the Germanic ally, that had killed a servant of his. This is also fascinating. Okay, we don't know why it happened, but also the important is that also this decision caused a reaction from the side of the Allies in general that refused to participate to the first phase of the battle. The Germans this time had a kind of seigneurial mindset regarding the proto-chivalric sense. I mean, this herald killing a serf is saying, if you have a serf, you're not a regular soldier, you're more like an aristocrat of sort, right? We know that the Longobards participated to the Byzantine army with some knights with retinue, so it's a properly strongly not an average horseman, like a stepped horse charge. These are, powerful guys. This have even servants. So here, aside from the reasons that we don't know, what is important is that a commander-in-chief like Narses at that point could impose on such allies, causing also not just military but maybe political problem, even this penalty due to the relation that existed between master and serf. That for these guys was humiliating. That's the reason why they wouldn't take part to the first part of the battle, right? So these were cases, however, mostly caused by betrayal, right, by treason. That was punished, of course, as we've seen, by law with death, or with degradation, torture, sometimes, to which also followed the confiscation of goods. Sometimes also the ones of their families were ruined and so on. So the crime, of course, was considered at the same level of lèse majesté, and the guilty suffered, let's say, treating as enemies and not as soldiers, right? And even worse, by rebels, by somebody who had lost honor, and that's why what the thing was accepted. And the law contemplated as normal tool of that for the soldiers, flogging, as we've seen, normally, but evidently the usages and the situations left, a large margin of maneuver for the magistrates that administrated justice. In other occasions, consequently, Belisarius didn't punish the guilty of serious crimes. This happened all the times, right? Even if you look at broader political moves, but since, I don't know, think about Caesar, that for eminently pragmatic and lucid, intelligent, rational reasons would spare a Gallic tribe that had rebelled, even after being crushed, and maybe exterminate completely one that had always been allied of Rome, to make things work, right? That's from those guys' perspective, you understand what's the deal, right? It's horrifying, but in practice, political and strategical terms, that may actually be a better maybe solution than else, because prolonging chaos, disorder, may bring to the death of many other people. So this is crude, immoral if you judge along those patterns, but it's still, maybe it functions. Unfortunately, these things happen still to this day, and it always will by a certain margin. There are examples from Belisarius. His Doriphorus Uliaris, that was, while drunk, wounded to death John the Armenian during a hunting party. And Belisarius didn't take any serious measure towards him, limiting himself probably to simple disciplinary sanctions. Why? Because it had been referred to him that John, while dying, had asked that the responsible not to be punished. And differently, towards a high officer that had aggressed his superior, as the Magister Militum Constantine did in Italy, having attempted to hit him during a quarrel, right, and was sentenced to death. The Roman armies were, however, in general, difficult structures to manage from the side of generals, as we were saying. Indiscipline and even open rebellion sometimes characterized the armies of the time. Why? Well, because the variegated ethnical and professional component didn't adapt easily to criteria of absolute subordination. So you imagine all these peoples coming together and all having their own laws, their own morals, their own culture, and more than that, also having to fit into an army that most of them had never quite seen before. 4 levels of standardization and centrality of command, right? But sometimes these people were so many that you couldn't quite enforce control over them, as we've seen. So collective indiscipline that often manifested also in the most crucial moments of military action, such as pitched battles, was an endemic problem. And at an institutional level, it also find a base in the lack, let's say, in the deficiencies of military hierarchies and in the administrative apparatus that frequently made the soldiers pay less, even for long periods of time. This is important. I mean, the payment, the Roman army here were not. I mean, they were, let's say, cyclical, but not quite regular, let's say, and therefore, and it was always a great problem just to feed these guys to even have an army in the first place. So a lot of politics of the Roman Empire gravitated around this, actually, because if you have the army, you have power, and that's where also problems in the think about this command switch of Belisarius and Narses in Italy, and all the ensuing political and strategical problems in the peninsula due to that. So generals, it is true, I mean, were generally dangerous. They tended to also make prevail their own personal jealousies and resentment, principally because, say, due to the lack of a strong power of command. We're talking about properly also among each other within the same army, right? This was, but at a higher level, was reflected instead by the fact that sovereigns didn't quite lead war personally still. So it's obvious that in case of Belisarius, you go in the westernmost frontier, and what kind of control can Constantinople have at some point? Of course, a political one, but still, it's difficult to actually see what he's going to do there. For example, the Emperor Maurice attempted in assuming personally the control of operations, and this was rejected as inconvenient by his own dignitaries. The great army sent against the Persians in 503 failed in his purpose because the generals that led the operations did it on their own account, and later on Anastasius I was obliged to recall to Constantinople one of them, the nephew Hypatius, sending on the theater of war the Magister Officiorum Celeris with full powers. The expedition in Lazica in 528 didn't achieve a again, the hoped result because of the reciprocal hostility of 3 commanders. In 538, Narses, that had been sent to Italy by Justinian with consistent reinforcements, retreated from the siege of Urbino, his troops, in order to damage Belisarius, and he brought as pretext the fact that the Generalissimo didn't respect to the letter the orders of that had been, given him by the sovereign, and that therefore the document with which he had been entrusted with supreme command was not valid anymore. And during the Eastern campaign of 541, Belisarius encamped a certain distance from Nisibis, but the Magister Militum Peter and the Dux Mesopotamiae John refused to follow him, encamping disorderly close to the walls, where they were surprised by the Persians. And in many cases, the indirect intervention of the emperor could put, an end to these contrasts, but an effective corrective, let's say, was not brought until in the following century Heraclius didn't command in person his armies. And in 577, in front of a situation that had gone out of control, Tiberius I appointed the future Emperor Maurice, that at that time was Comes Excubitorum, as supreme commander with discretional command in order to cope with the command paralysis. The generals, according John of Ephesus, were in complete disagreement and kept writing to the sovereign to damage each other respectively, and Tiberius therefore appointed as commander of the Eastern army the Comes Excubitorum Maurice, quoting, giving him supreme authority on all the magistri and tribunes of the army, and forbidding to anybody of disobeying him for any reason. So you understand the ad hoc measure here, right? The emperor naturally has this eminent political and military authority, can literally confer the imperium as absolute authority on the field to his appointees in order to put an end to this. Of course, it wouldn't be enough most of the times, as we have realized. And discontent among the troops sometimes even exploded in clamorous events. The Limitanae of the East remained, for example, for many years without pay, and thus in 540 the garrison of Beroea, that had to be composed by the soldiers, deserted to pass to the Sassanids, to the Persians, lamenting the long delay of the pay. So the phenomenon was accentuated. We made a video on the 6th century Limitane, right? And we've seen here how things were actually changing gradually. Everything was taking an ever more, local character at some levels. It was an heterogeneous situation, but here we even have the problem of, if you don't pay the soldiers will not just, desert. They will literally pass to the enemy of the same frontier they're supposed to defend. Guess why? Because because the enemy is interested in gaining the place where they live as Limitane, and therefore they can't simply buy them as any other soldier, a mercenary, right? So the phenomenon accentuated physiologically with the expedition corps in Italy and in Africa, on the western side, because they were irregularly provided with money by Constantinople, when the local income couldn't satisfy alone the maintenance of great army corps. The mutiny of the African army in 536 was in part due to the confiscation of lands obtained by the soldiers, marrying Vandal women, that were essentially one of their enemies, lands that granted fixed rent with which they could obviate to the delay of the pay. And the wide consensus to the rebel movement is a clear index of the military malaise that is again present in the Italian army, albeit not with such evident manifestations, up to the conclusive phases of the Gothic War, when Narses actually paid all the salaries that had not been versed. And the problem was, however, destined to represent itself a few years later with further delays to the salaries. At the beginning of his pontificate in 590, Gregory I was complaining how the danger of a military mutiny had to be deemed as more serious of the external threat of the Longobards. Gregory was playing a little because, of course, Rome was a bit on its own at that point, so there was technically a Roman contingent in the city, but still matters were more in the locals' hands. And still in 592, when Rome was threatened, the Theodosiaci, garrisoned in the urbs, quote, barely disposed themselves to the defense of the walls. So this tells you like what also the general effectiveness of these troops could really be, but there is a reason, because they hadn't been paid, and only in 596 discipline was re-established with the arrival from Constantinople of the scribo Busa that brought money for the pays. And the most serious episode happened in Italy during the Gothic War was undoubtedly the mass desertion of the Illyrian soldiers that in 545, in front of a paradoxical situation of abandonment of the Balkans, in the meanwhile, while the army was fighting in Italy, they came back their own lands, lamenting the usual delays in the pay, but also and especially because their wives and children had been deported in slavery by the invading Bulgars. And after the death of Justinian, the chronicle logistical difficulties were cited by the pressing need to cut the expenses in order to face in practice the financial burden posed by war. Maurice in 588 decided, probably incautiously, to reduce the pace of 1/4, but the eastern army that was quartered at Edessa mutinied, obliging the Magister Militum Priscus to escape, and he had, by the way, already disliked by the troops because of his inconstant behavior. And Priscus repaired to Constantina, trying a useless negotiation through the bishops of the two cities, but the revolt momentarily calmed down only when the Persian invasion started. So, common problem. So an emergency that boosted the military honor of the troops that decided to fight in order to And the mutiny, however, went on because the army elected new officers. They chose themselves as their own commander the dukes of the Lebanese Phoenicia, Germanus, who convinced the troops to resume the offensive in different directions, even reporting a brilliant victory in the battle that was fought close to Martyropolis. So here you have an army that, here you have a problem that goes beyond the pace, right? This is about the distrust towards command, at the point that these soldiers evidently made the right choices, even appointing their own next commander, would make them score a great victory, all on their own. So the formal reconciliation with the emperor happened only in 589, with the mediation of the Patriarch of Antioch, Gregory, that enjoyed wide popularity among the soldiers, of whose he was a benefactor. And as many of his clergymen of his time substituted himself in this case to the lay authorities that were naturally proposed to tasks of such a kind. And so this is a bit like the state that is declining for sure in its public authority. Albeit the church surely was framed also in the same state, especially in the Byzantine Empire. And already before, however, Maurice had to yield sending the complete pay, and the resentment of the troop had still not vanished. And on the contrary, the fracture between the command and the lower hierarchy increased. In 593, the order to spend winter across the Danube was, at the point of causing a new mutiny, and the Magister Militum Priscus deemed more, prudent not to execute it after his experience in the East. And the commutation of the indemnity for arms and uniforms the following year caused a great, disappointment. But this time the Magister Militum Peter, that was the brother of the emperor that had substituted Priscus in command, managed to calm the soldiers, announcing other provisions destined to grant the pension to the veterans and the maintenance at the expense of the state of the sons of the fallen in service. And in 602, however, the situation became uncontrollable. The movement of rebellion could not be stopped up to the deposition of the sovereign. The desire of whom to economize was intolerable for the soldiers in the first place. Anyhow, for today we stop here. You realize so the complexity of managing such a system, because you would think this happened for some bad moral corruption, but first of all, every state was corrupted at the time. I mean, this is typical of any pre-industrial society that cannot enforce authority like we can now, right? Simply doesn't have the coercive means. Surely there were people speculating on this. There was, as we've said, an increasing privatization of the armies. Political discontinuity, instability surely didn't help either. There was let's say a structural difficulty in the first place to provide the means for maintaining these troops that were very often not a matter of option, right? If you don't have the money because an harvest goes wrong, because if you don't give that, the mob of Constantinople raises, or maybe on another frontier that there is something messed up, even more messed up going on. If you fear that giving too much means to that general, that front would embolden the command so that he could create a rebellion. If there are, everything that this is from Clausewitz, right? This is the Clausewitz in Trinity. This is what, everything, war is subordinated to politics no matter what, right? So this is the main problem, actually. But also don't think that there was any specific misfunction that you can attribute here, let's say, to the fact that these were the Byzantines or someone else. And let's acknowledge in the first place that the rest of the world was pretty messed up, even worse. So this was the only state worth of a name in the Western Eurasia, right? So the question is, look at what others were doing there, and you see there literally a privatistic reality. Think about here we have seen even these ethnic contingents that came from, they were, let's say, they came from realities that hadn't educated them in civil values, in that they believed in the strength of, in the superior of the strongest, in things like, pride, individual, they had to be framed under discipline. This is a problem. I mean, the Roman army has always been, the great the great disciplining instrument, right? Of all these troops that joined eventually to remain, the so-called barbarians were Romanized in that sense. But at this point, it had become difficult. It costed too much, and threats were very great. So there were certain compromises would bring to such instability, and this is the period in itself. There would be surely deeper considerations to make in order to of course acknowledge how this, the broader, the administration functioned, like what the military was paid like for, and what other means. So these are things we will see on another occasion. The reason I remember to you always, I think a Byzantine army playlist specific, because I made Roman warfare altogether, like in split Roman army, Byzantine army, well, just for people who are going to type that for the search. But there is also the migration era playlist. So if you're interested in a comparative analysis, let's say, of all these various peoples too, we talk about that. And there is surely a lot to tell. Yeah, this is just beginning. Like, if I to tell you, I don't know how many videos I made about the Byzantine army, like 30, 40, whatever. This is not even just 1/10 of all the things we have to say, right? So be prepared. These videos now are cut just for this is for the 6th century, but there is so much more to say for other periods as well. So for now, we stop really here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.